Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Gavin Cleespies, and I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. I would like to extend a special welcome to anyone who might be attending a virtual program with MHS for the first time. We had a relatively good number of people sign up for the program, so hopefully there's some new people joining us. If you are not familiar with the Massachusetts Historical Society, we are the oldest historical society in America. We were founded in 1791 and have been an independent nonprofit institution dedicated to collecting, preserving, publishing, and sharing our state and our nation's history for the past 229 years. In these days of social distancing, we have taken to hosting virtual events, and we have online events planned for every week through the end of June. Our next program is next Friday at this time at 2 o'clock, and we are hosting author Abram Van Engel on his book, City on a Hill, A History of American Exceptionalism. You can visit our website, masshist.org, to find more information on it. Today we have a great program that will hopefully ease people's longing for the run-up to the Stanley Cup. Our speaker is Thomas J. Whalen, who is an associate professor of social science at Boston University. He is the author of a number of books, including Kennedy versus Lodge, the 1952 Massachusetts Senate race, and A Higher Purpose, Profiles in Presidential Courage. He also authored the book, When the Red Sox Ruled, Baseball's First Dynasty, 1912 to 1918, which we featured in our Red Sox program last week. He is an expert in modern American politics, American foreign policy, and the American presidency. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to our speaker, Tom Whalen.
Delighted to be here. Thank you. Well, let's begin. I wrote a book that's coming out next month called Kooks Degenerates on Ice, Bobby Orr, the Big Bad Bruins, and the Stanley Cup Championship that transformed hockey. And when you stop and think about it, when you think about it, Boston has been blessed and New England's been blessed by some great teams over the years, such as, of course, the famed Break the Curse 2004 Red Sox team. The great Bill Russell-led Celtics teams of the 1960s that won 8 NBA championships in a row, including 9 of 11. And most recently, of course, the Tom Brady-led New England Patriots, which won 6 Super Bowl championships over the last 2 decades, which unfortunately, that era has come to an end with Brady going to Tampa Bay next. But often lost in the conversation of great sports franchises here, unfortunately, I think, is those Boston Bruins teams that were led by Bobby Orr in the early 1970s, the Big Bad Bruins. And it's strange because when you think about it, those Bruins teams, they own Boston in a way and New England that even Tom Brady and the New England Patriots at the height of their popularity and acclaim never were able to. And you have to remember, this was a different period of time. Because when you think about it, there was only 3 major network television stations, a CBS, ABC, and NBC affiliate in the Boston area. And they had what was called then UHF stations with bad signals, bad reception. And one of them was TV 38, WSBK TV. And they broadcast the Bruins games. And during the height of Bobby Orr and the Big Bad Bruins fame, they were drawing a 25 share locally, which meant 1 in 4 television sets in the Boston, New England area were tuned in to Boston Bruins games. And as a result, network programming on those ABC, NBC, and CBS affiliates dropped 25%. That's an incredible viewing audience. But that was the kind of hold the Bruins and that team had on the New England region. And also because a lot of these broadcasts were also sent to Canada, places like Newfoundland, the maritime provinces, the Bruins were able to garner, and it still is the case today, a tremendous Canadian following that reaches all the way to Ontario. And in the late 60s, going into the 70s, the NHL was able to score a major network contract with CBS, where they broadcast a game on the weekend. And CBS ratings, when the Bruins were on, and thanks to the presence of Orr, skyrocketed, which transformed the NHL from kind of a minor league operation, kind of like an afterthought when compared to Major League Baseball and the NFL at the time, to a major league, and kind of ushered in the beginning of big money to professional hockey. Next. And at the same time, that Bobby Orr, led Big Bad Bruins team, it inspired a number of local hockey players, such as Massachusetts-born hockey players like Micah Ruzioni, Jim Craig, Jack O'Callahan, who spearheaded the 1980 Miracle on Ice U.S. men's Olympic hockey team at Lake Placid in their upset gold medal victory. And at the time, hockey, when the Bruins played and were at the height in the early 1970s, late 60s, hockey was primarily dominated by Canadian players. But because of their success, the Bruins' success, a number of not just Massachusetts but American-born players took up the game and were inspired to reach to newer heights in their style and abilities. And that is what really kind of laid the groundwork for that gold medal victory in many ways in 1980. Next. Next. But you have to understand first the context of what was going on at that time and why the Bruins were so big. People were desperate for distractions because the world, like today, was not a very pleasant place. The United States was still embroiled in the Vietnam War, which was tearing our society apart domestically as well. Next. Next. Also, in 1970, President Richard Nixon decided to temporarily expand the war in Southeast Asia with the invasion of Cambodia. Next. Next. And that led to an explosion of anti-war protests across the country, especially on our nation's college campuses. Next. Next. And that led to one of the most tragic events in the early 1970s. On May 4th, 1970, Ohio National Guardsmen at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio, fired into a crowd of student protesters, killing 4 of them. And this is one of the protesters who was shot and did not survive, unfortunately. This photograph, in fact, won the Pulitzer Prize that year in 1970. Next. 11 days afterwards, after that Kent State shooting, predominantly African-American Jackson State University in Mississippi also saw 2 students shot by local law enforcement officers when the local law enforcement officers fired directly into a girls' dormitory. And here you can see the results, the bullet holes, the aftermath. Next. And after these shootings at Kent State and Jackson State, 364 college campuses and universities across the country decided to stop their proceedings. They closed up shop for fear that this would lead to more and more violence as a result of these anti-war demonstrations. And students marched everywhere, especially here in Boston. But President Nixon got so concerned that one march that was scheduled near the White House, he decided in the pre-dawn hours to visit, to establish a dialogue with some of the student anti-war demonstrators on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And here he is at that time trying to talk to the students. And it was a very kind of stilted conversation. The students later said he didn't look them in the eye. And bizarrely, he talked about Syracuse University college football, and surfing. Next. And afterward, his chief of staff, Bob Holloman, wrote in his diary, he said, "This is the weirdest day of all." And it certainly was. Next. Now, on television, Americans tried to escape all the bad news, as we do today, by turning to comedy. And leading the ratings was this kind of new, innovative sketch show comedy called Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, which launched the career of future Academy Award winner Goldie Hawn. Next. At movie theaters, Americans were going to see films like Love Story, which was the most popular film in 1970. It was a tearjerker about a young couple who were in love who received tragic news. The couple was played by Ali MacGraw and Ryan O'Neal. Ali MacGraw's character is diagnosed with a fatal disease. And the tagline, "Love means never having to say you're sorry," was repeated throughout the country. It has become a major cliche over the years. Next. But the really big entertainment news in 1970 was the breakup of the Beatles. And the previous January, they played what turned out to be their final concert on the roof of their recording studio on Abbey Road in London. And the concert a bit until local police went to the roof and stopped it because there were various noise complaints against the Beatles. And as John Lennon was leaving the stage, he told everyone within earshot, "I hope we pass the audition." And I guess you could say they did. Next. In sports, well, just as the world seemed tumultuous, so did the sporting scene. And Muhammad Ali, having been banned and having his heavyweight boxing title stripped from him from refusing to register for the military draft for Vietnam, a local a district federal judge in New York basically gave his right to fight back. So he returned to boxing. And the following year, thanks to a landmark Supreme Court decision, Ali, who was convicted of draft evasion, had that conviction overturned. So he was able to contend for the heavyweight title. Next. In baseball, there was a revolution of sorts on the labor front, which affected all major league sports moving forward. Curt Flood, the all-star center fielder for the St. Louis Cardinals, refused to report to the Philadelphia Phillies after he had been traded there after the 1969 season. And basically he said that, he felt like a piece of meat and that he, as a American citizen, had the right to work for any team he wanted, that he didn't have to subscribe to baseball rules. And although he was unsuccessful in his court case, his fight against Major League Baseball led to the eventual establishment of free agency and the era of big money in professional sports. Next. Now, the NHL also was undergoing some major growing pains by 1970. A few years before, they decided to double the size of the league. Originally, there were 6 franchises, but by 1970, there were now 12. And basically, the franchises that were added were all in American cities. Next. Including the California Seals that played out of Oakland, a very kind of inept outfit. But the idea here was the NHL, they wanted to capture the American television audience. So they put teams in various strategic locales, such as Pittsburgh, such as Oakland, and with the hope that they could greatly expand the fan base and television ratings. Next. But it was the Bruins, those Kooks and Degenerates, as they were known as, who basically made the NHL a brand name when it came to television sports entertainment. And when you think about the Bruins, by 1970, they'd come a long way since their founding in 1924. Next. Because the Bruins were founded by a local grocery magnate by the name of Charles Adams. And he basically saw the Bruins as a money-making opportunity. And on the advice of an office secretary, he decided to call them Bruins because she heard him say that he wanted to name his team after a kind of a fierce animal. And Bruins just seemed to sound right when you coupled it with Boston. There was a certain alliterative character to it. So the Bruins name stuck. Next. And a star early performer for the Bruins, really the athlete that kind of made the Bruins, was a defenseman of Hall of Fame caliber known as Eddie Shore. And his nickname was appropriately Old Blood and Guts because although he's very talented, he also had a violent streak. And no one, including his own teammates, wanted to mess with him on or off the ice. And with Mr. Shore, they were able to win 2 Stanley Cups over the next 2 decades. And when he left the Bruins in 1940, the Bruins were able to win an additional cup. Next. But after World War II, the Bruins, frankly, weren't able to raise another championship Stanley Cup banner to the rafters at Boston Garden, though they were able to make history. In 1958, they were able to sign a player named Willie O'Ree from Canada, who broke the NHL's official color line. Next. Next. And they also were able to develop players like high-scoring forward Johnny Busick. And he would play a prominent role on that 1970 team. He would be an inspirational leader as well as a key contributor on that Bobby Orr squad. Next. But it was with the arrival of Bobby Orr in 1966 that made the franchise truly a reborn one. Because by the time the Bruins got to the 1960s, they were basically an also-ran team. They went something like over 6 seasons without making the playoffs. And it seemed pretty bleak in terms of the team's hopes until they were able to sign young Bobby Orr. Next. And Bobby Orr had plenty of help in 1970 from players that were developed in the 1960s, like clutch scorer and kind of the unpredictable player off the ice, Derek Sanderson, who was a center. Next. Also, tough forward John Pie McKenzie, who got his nickname Pie due to the shape of his face. Next. Also, all-star was a confidence in the NHL. Next. Next. And also, they developed an all-star goaltender in Gerry Cheevers, who had one of the most iconic masks in hockey, became kind of an emblem in all sports. Whenever he had a shot like directly on his mask, aimed at his head essentially, he basically drew in kind of fake scars, what kind of scar he would have had if not wearing the mask. And this, again, became a very iconic image. Altogether, during the course of his career, he had 67 kind of these drawn-on scars on his face. Next. Now, the general manager in the late 60s, Milt Schmidt, he was the guy who kind of helped put it all together. And he put the final touches on this team that would win the Stanley Cup in 1970. And the big move he made was acquiring Phil Esposito and Ken Hodge from the Chicago Blackhawks. Next. And Esposito here is on the left, and Ken Hodge is on the right. Esposito became a top NHL goal scorer for the Bruins and Hall of Famer. Next. And the team gelled once they got Esposito. They suddenly became a playoff contender. And the person who kind of was the straw that stirred this drink of various elements together was their young coach, Harry Sinden, who was named coach in 1966 when Orr came aboard. Next. But before the 1970 season started, the Bruins were in Ottawa playing an exhibition game against the St. Louis Blues. And they lost the services of their all-star defenseman, Ted Green, for the entire season as a result. But it could have been a lot worse because Ted Green was near death as a result of what happened in this exhibition game. Next. Because during the course of this game, it was really a nothing game with the St. Louis Blues, he got into a stick fight, as he often did with players around the league, with a St. Louis player by the name of Wayne Mackey. And as I mentioned earlier, Green had the reputation of being a real tough guy around the NHL. And he would get into several fights. The president of the New York Rangers at one point got so frustrated with Green that he publicly announced a bounty should be called for his head. And 1970, so this was nothing new. He gets into the stick fight with Wayne Mackey, as shown here. Next. And in the middle of this stick fight, Mackey takes his stick and hits it squarely on Green's head. And Green had a cracked skull. He immediately fell to the ice. And he almost lost his life. Eventually, he had to have a plastic plate put in his head to kind of seal the wound in his skull. And he lost for a decent period of time control over, I believe it was the left side of his body. And he later said that his left arm basically felt like a string of spaghetti. Miraculously, next, and here he is, this is what he said. The skull splintered and they had to find the bits and pieces floating along inside. Pretty scary moment in the life of Ted Green, and it shocked his fellow Bruins. Next. Now, miraculously, Ted Green was able to come back and play the next season with a helmet. And he was one of the first NHL players to use the helmet all the time. So he kind of helped popularize the use of the hockey helmet, which we take for granted today in the modern NHL. And although he was able to come back, he was never quite the same player. He was never kind of that all-star caliber player that he had been earlier with the Bruins. And he eventually ended up playing for the rival WHA. And the New England Whalers, who initially began their franchise in Boston, they won the first WHA championship. And Ted Green was a major contributor on that team. Next. And as the ironic thing here is that Wayne Mackey, the person who put him in the hospital that kind of really damaged his career, he ended up dying at a young age. He didn't even survive the 1970s of a cerebral hemorrhage. So Ted Green ended up outliving by a substantial margin Wayne Mackey. Next. But when you talk about this team, even though Ted Green was lost and he was a major leader on the Bruins, Bobby Orr filled the void of leadership. And now the team really became his. And he did not disappoint, Mr. Orr. Next. And Orr had come to the Bruins at the age of 14. And here he is at that age. And even though he weighed like 125 pounds, it was obvious early on, even though he was playing with hockey players much older than him, that he was a dominant player. No one had ever seen anyone like Bobby Orr. The kind of speed he had, the kind of moves he had. He was kind of the Michael Jordan on ice. And so he quickly moved up through the ranks through the Bruins organization. Next. And he made it to the Bruins for the 1966 season with his new coach, Harry Sinden. And in coming to the Bruins, he also caused kind of a financial revolution in the game because he signed for then a record salary, $50,000 over 2 years with a $25,000 signing bonus. And this was money that had never been seen before in the NHL. The average NHL player made around $18,000 a year, and the highest paid player only made $40,000. So Bobby Orr, as a rookie, was breaking all the norms. And this would bring on, along with the television contract and the kind of visibility of the Big Bad Bruins, would help bring on a financial revolution in the NHL moving forward. Next. And this was Harry Sinden's comment on Bobby Orr. Bobby Orr was a star from the moment they played the national anthem in that first game. And he became the Rookie of the Year that year in the NHL. And he was by far the best player the Bruins had on the team, even though, he was just 18 years old. And again, he was special and everyone knew it. And he was considered the savior of the Bruins franchise, which again, up to this point, had been an also-ran for so many years. Next. And here is Bobby Orr signing that contract. And you can see the boyish enthusiasm on his face along with his father. Next. But the Bruins were not in any way a one-man team. Phil Esposito, the center that the Bruins were able to acquire from the Chicago Blackhawks in what was considered one of the most lopsided deals in NHL history, he also was a major contributor to that 1970 Bruins team. He led the NHL in goals more than once. He was a great scorer, and here he is where he loved to be in most games. He'd like to basically park himself in front of the net and take a short pass and just kind of whip it by the enemy goaltender. And he did this again and again and again. Next. And this was a common saying around New England at the time. You could see it on bumper stickers on people's cars. Jesus saves, but Esposito scores on the rebound. And that was probably true. Next. But one thing to know about Esposito, that he was a very kind of superstitious guy. And, he would consult Ouija boards to predict future game performances. He was a big guy on having amulets, luck charms, and also set routines. And in every game, he made sure that he wore a black turtleneck under his game jersey. So he was kind of almost like OCD. And he would absolutely freak out when he saw in a locker room cross sticks, as this illustration shows, because he saw that as a bad sign of luck. He said when he was in the minor leagues, he saw a cross sticks in a locker room one time, and the next thing he knew, he said, my teammate broke a leg. And so he was very kind of superstitious in that way. And he once claimed that after he had been traded, someone had given him the evil eye. That's why he'd been traded. So kind of a quirky guy, but a hell of a hockey player. Next. And here he is with the Chicago Blackhawks. But, he was superstitious, but he also had a short fuse. He went to Catholic school as a young man, but he basically was thrown out after he told the head nun there that she could go stick it when she tried to discipline him. So he dropped out of high school and entered hockey. Next. And what got him essentially traded from the Blackhawks was he was very outspoken and critical of team management and the team's coach. And it came to a head one time when he was out in LA, and he decided with his best buddy, Bobby Hull of the Chicago Blackhawks, to visit the television of which they were. And he fell immediately in Montgomery. And apparently afterwards, he had one too many beers. Next. And he got back to his hotel room, and he called up his coach, and this is what he said. Hey, Bill, Phil Esposito here. I get a bad bleeping leg here. And you can imagine the coach or team management did not appreciate this kind of behavior. And he also was very direct with the team's general manager. So they got rid of him in that one-sided deal to the Bruins because they thought he was a head case. And unfortunately for the Bruins, he was no head case. He was a transformative player. Next. And here he is in with the Bruins at the height of his career. Next. But there was a lot more to the Bruins aside from Orr and Esposito. And after all, they were known as the Big Bad Bruins. And they were the toughest, meanest outfit in the National Hockey League. And they loaded up on the penalty minutes. And teams were physically intimidated by them. Next. And this is a comment from the historian Randy Roberts. They were viewed as modern-day Vikings, a collection of athletes with the ethics of a motorcycle gang. And they really were. They were a wild bunch, kind of like the hockey version of the Gas House. Next. And they had players like Pi McKenzie, who was a tough guy on ice, but equally outrageous off the ice. He once stole a local police officer's bike and drove it into a bar. Next. There's also players like Wayne Cashman, who he was a really good player for the Bruins, but at the same time he had a wild streak, and he once did an impromptu striptease, in front of Boston City Hall. Next. And Bobby Orr was not, above committing such hijinks as his teammates. Next. For example, when Phil Esposito one season, at the end of one season, found himself in a hospital because he had a cast going from his toes up to his hip, he had to go to Mass General Hospital to recuperate. Next. Here's a picture of Mass General Hospital. And while he was recuperating in bed, he couldn't move at all because of the long cast on him. Next. Bobby Orr decided to pick up his spirits by disguising himself as a Mass General doctor, and he got in kind of full surgical gear. And Dr. Orr found where Esposito's room was, and with some teammates, they were able to basically kidnap Esposito from his Mass General hospital room. Next. So they took his gurney and they brought it all the way out onto the street outside of Mass General Hospital. Next. And while Orr and his teammates were pushing Esposito down the street outside of Mass General, next, Orr leaned over to Esposito and said, "Could you stick out your hand and make a left-hand turn?" Pretty outrageous behavior. And that's exactly what Orr did, because as Esposito realized, there was a car behind us. And Orr made the proper call, the left-hand turn, because he wanted to avoid contact with the car. Next. And Orr eventually ended up at a local tavern, which he owned. And Orr and Esposito, by the way, was still in his hospital gurney bed. He had a grand old time at this bar. And the next morning, Orr and the Bruins decided to return Esposito to Mass General Hospital. And the Mass General Hospital was in full alarm because they didn't know overnight where Esposito was. He just wasn't in his hospital bed when they went to check on him. And when Esposito came back the following morning to Mass General, they put him on a full security lockdown. Next. But outrageous as the Bruins were, and I think the backup goaltender Eddie Johnson described it best. We were just a bunch of kooks and degenerates who all got along. The most outrageous, the most zaniest of Bruins of them all was center Derek Sanderson. And here he is on the cover of a 1971 issue of Boston Magazine. St. Derek, I guess you could call it. And this is one of my favorite all-time photographs, because here he is kind of in a saint-like pose with a cigarette dangling out of his mouth. I mean, you don't see stuff like that these days in kind of the PR consciousness of modern-day athletes. Next. And Derek Sanderson was completely irreverent. And to give you an idea, when he appeared as a guest on the old Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, Carson asked him a very innocent question. He said, Derek, when you're finished playing hockey, what do you plan to do with your life? And Sanderson looked directly into Johnny Carson's eyes and said, well, your chair looks awfully good to me. He was never invited back as a guest on the Tonight Show, not surprisingly. Next. Now, Sanderson, he loved to make a show, and he would show up at events and in the locker room wearing kind of these tailored Edwardian suits. He wore his hair long, and he said and did outrageous things. And he hung out with A-list celebrities like Joe Namath, the Super Bowl winning quarterback of the New York Jets, whom he once owned a nightclub with. Next. And Sanderson eventually ended up owning a bar, the famed Daisy Buchanan's on Newbury Street. And this became a major mecca for athletes and celebrities in Boston for several decades. Next. But Derek, probably the most outrageous thing he ever did was he wanted to break into movies. And he got a role in a movie that was shot in Montreal. He was to play, surprise, surprise, a hockey coach. And the film was completed, and Sanderson, when it came down to screening or pre-screening the film, he was there with his agent, Bob Wolf, next, who later became the agent for Larry Bird. And Wolf and Sanderson were in the audience of this screening, and it suddenly dawned on them that the film Derek Sanderson had signed up for and performed in was actually a porno film. Sanderson didn't realize it because the one scene that he shot was completely clean. And suddenly now, as they're watching this screening, that, all the other scenes that Sanderson was not in was like wild sexual antics going on. Bob Wolf realized that this could end Derek Sanderson's career. The early 1970s were kind of a crazy time in American culture, but not that crazy. So he negotiated a deal to excise Sanderson's scene from the movie. Next. And Sanderson didn't seem too concerned about this, and he was kind of a, loose guy. This is what he said: I figure a guy needs three things to succeed in hockey. One is points, the second is talent, and the third is color. On this team, Phil Esposito has the points, Bobby Orr has the talent, but this kid, gesturing to himself, is the one who's going to have the color. And he had that in abundance. No question about that. Next. And for the Bruins, even though they won their first 7 games and were among the league leaders throughout most of the season, they were kind of nipped at the end of the regular season by the Chicago Blackhawks of Stan Nikita and Bobby Hull. And Bobby Hull, people forget how great a player he was a tremendous scorer. And he was the one, along with Stan Nikita, or popularized, I should say, the curved stick. So if you were a New Englander, a young person in New England in the late 60s, early 1970s, if you didn't have a curved stick, it was also called a banana stick, playing street hockey or ice hockey, you were not a hockey player. You didn't understand hockey. And so the Chicago Blackhawks were able to beat out the Bruins in the regular season, but this did not concern the Bruins too much. Next. Because with Bobby Orr leading the way, they went through the first 2 rounds of the NHL playoffs like a hot knife through butter. And they only lost 2 games. And in their kind of Eastern Division final against the Chicago Blackhawks, who, after all, had outpointed them during the regular season, they swept them in 4 straight games. Next. And when they played the Blackhawks, it was an interesting dynamic taking place because Tony Esposito, the younger brother of Phil Esposito, he was in net for the Blackhawks. And Esposito, all he did that year was become the best goaltender, rookie goaltender in the league, and I believe he won Rookie of the Year honors. But it didn't help him against his big brother in the Eastern Division Finals. Again, they were swept in 4 straight games. Next. The final round of the playoffs, the Stanley Cup Finals, were against the St. Louis Blues. And the Blues were an interesting team. They were an expansion team when the NHL expanded to 12 teams back in the late 60s. And they had a decent team, though they didn't have the kind of talent level that the Bruins had. Next. Next. They were led by 2 goaltenders, the Blues were. Jacques Plante, as you can see in this picture, he was the one who pioneered the use of hockey masks. Before Jacques Plante, goaltenders in the NHL, and really at all levels, did not wear masks. So you can imagine what a number it did on their face. And even in this case, you can see Jacques Plante, even with the mask, it didn't seem to make much of a difference. It was a pretty rough and tumble game then, as it is now. Next. The other goaltender, next, on the Blues was Glenn Hall, whose nickname was Mr. Hockey. And between Plante and Hall, they made a formidable dynamic duo that made the Blues, a decent contender. Though, again, not on the level, quite on the level of the Boston Bruins. Next. Next. And this is a picture of Glenn Hall close-up. And again, his nickname was Mr. Goalie. And for a good part of his career, it's hard to believe now, he played without a mask. If that isn't a profile of courage, I don't know what is. Taking shots, going 100 miles an hour, aimed at your face. Next. Next. Now, the Scotty Bowman, who later gained quite a bit of fame as a Hall of Fame coach with the Montreal Canadiens in the 70s, he was the coach of this team, the Blues team. And, he had quite a hill to climb when facing the Big Bad Bruins in the Stanley Cup Finals. He knew he didn't have the talent that the Bruins had. So he tried to use some strategy to try to make up for the shortfall. Next. And he said, in order to beat the Bruins, you had to take Bobby Orr out of the equation, as shown here. Next. Next. Yeah, here we go. And what he did was, Scott, the coach of the Blues, tapped Jim Roberts, a kind of quick forward for the Blues, to basically shadow Orr on the ice whenever he was out there, to prevent him from getting passes to score. And this had some limited success. Orr definitely was bothered by Jim Roberts following around on the ice. Next. But a funny thing happened in that first game when Scotty Bowman ordered Roberts to follow Orr around on the ice. Scotty Bowman told Roberts, you know what? I want you to be so close to Orr on the ice that you can tell me the kind of gum he chews. Next. And Roberts, in that first game, after kind of trying to keep up with Orr on the ice, Orr had tremendous speed, stop and start moves. Roberts, it was more than Roberts could handle. By the time he got back to the St. Louis bench at the end of the game, he was completely out of breath. And next. Oh, back one, sorry. He went to Scotty Bowman, the St. Louis coach, and Scotty Bowman was saying, okay, he couldn't understand what Roberts was trying to tell him. And he basically told Roberts, out with it. What are you trying to say? And Roberts eventually spit out what he was trying to say. He said, juicy fruit, because, he was told, I want you to know what kind of gum that Bobby Orr is chewing out there. Well, it was, in fact, juicy fruit. Next. But that series against St. Louis, it was no contest at all. The Bruins, once again, just as they did to the Chicago Blackhawks, swept in 4 games. And the only close game was the 4th game. It ended up tied in regulation, 3-3. And in the sudden death overtime period, Harry Sinden, the coach, decided to put out a defensive line because St. Louis was putting out their best scoring line. And on this defensive line, he put Bobby Orr and Derek Sanderson, who was considered, apart from his kind of extracurricular ways, was considered one of the best face-off men in the NHL. Next. And right at the beginning of the sudden death overtime period, Bobby Orr saw an opening in the defense, and he passed to Sanderson, who was in the corner, on a give and go, and Sanderson then, with Orr breaking towards the net from center ice, passed it back to him. Next. And as a result, Orr was able to get the puck by the outstretched right leg and arm of Glenn Hall. And in the process, he was tripped up, and he went flying through the air, as you can see here. Next. Next. Is it frozen? Next. Oh, yeah. And when Orr, after flying through the air, like some people compared to Superman, and he really seemed like Superman. Hey, you just won the Stanley Cup. By the time he landed on the ice, his teammates surrounded him, and it was bedlam because this was in Boston, and both on and off the ice, the city of Boston went berserk. And this was on, interestingly enough, Mother's Day, May 10th, 1970. And it was an unseasonably warm day. It was 90 degrees outside Boston Garden. And sheer chaos of joy took place in Boston Garden and throughout all of New England. The Bruins had not won a championship since World War II. And so this was a major event. Next. But when you stop and think about what is remembered, how we remember that special moment in Boston history, really in all hockey history, it was due to the efforts of this man. He was a veteran photographer for the old Boston Record American. His name was Ray Lucier. And he happened to be in the right place at the right time to capture Bobby Orr in midair after he scored that Stanley Cup game winner. Next. And he captured the moment with his Nikon F camera with 35 millimeter lens. Next. And this is the shot he captured, which I'm sure most of you are very well aware of. This was later voted the greatest photo in hockey history. Bobby Orr scoring the winning goal. And, Orr said when he was in midair, he felt like he was going to fly out of the building. And certainly you could see that, yeah, he probably could. He was super Bobby here. And you could see the crowd in the background responding. It was truly a historic moment in Major League sports. Next. And the celebration lasted several days afterward. And this was before the time we had duck boats in Boston. You just have to use regular cars. Here are Orr in the Bruins greeting the fans in a parade through downtown Boston on their way to Boston City Hall and Government Center for a reception hosted by then Mayor Kevin White. Next. And during that City Hall reception that was held by Mayor White, Pi McKenzie decided, and they were given these kind of very ceremonial, what was called Paul Revere bowls. Pi McKenzie decided to take a bowl, fill it up with beer, and douse Mayor White with beer. Next photo. And White was drenched in beer. And I think in many ways that was appropriate, especially the perfect coder for a team of Kooks and Degenerates and that particular moment in American history. So I'm done. I think we can move to, and here they are, that moment in time, the Big Bad Bruins at the height of their fame and fortune. What a team. And it's great talking about this. I'd love to take whatever questions and answers you might have. Delighted to help out.
So people can raise their hands as we showed earlier, or they can type questions in the Q&A. I see that Linda has her hand raised, so I'm going to allow her to talk. So,
hi, Linda.
Linda?
So quick clarification, it's Ken on Linda's Zoom account.
Oh,
fair enough.
Sorry about that.
Sorry about that. So two quick things. So help me clarify. I can remember going into Logan Airport when the Bruins won. I thought it was the Stanley Cup, and
you're thinking of 1972. When
okay.
They beat the Rangers out for the 1972 in the finals.
Yeah, and that was pandemonium as well.
Right. I think Phil Esposito said he had to climb a fence at Logan Airport to escape the crowd in '72. And that team won 2 Stanley Cups. And many argue they should have won more given the talent on that team. But unfortunately what happened was due to the popularity of the Bruins and the rising television ratings, it spawned a rival hockey league, the WHA. And they stole a number of players, the WHA, from the Bruins roster, including Derek Sanderson, Gerry Cheevers, and Pi McKenzie. And the Bruins never quite recovered from that.
Yeah, those are some great players. Real quickly, can you speak to, so I've met Derek a couple of different times, and I know, he went down a road with alcohol and drugs and came out the other side. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. It's an amazing story. He went to the WHA. He wanted to stay with the Bruins, but they offered him the largest contract of any athlete in the world after the 1972 season. And I'm not kidding you. I think it was like $3 million or close to $3 million, some ridiculous amount at the time. And he was making more money than Pelé, the famed Brazilian soccer player. And turned out he was a bust. It was for a team called the Philadelphia Blazers of the WHA, which did not last very long. And he got injured, and he basically did not play very much. And the Philly fans hated him. And so he went back to the Bruins, but he was never able to recapture that ability that he had, that special ability with the Bruins. And he kind of drifted from team to team after that. And his notoriety was growing all the while. And unfortunately, he always drank, but now he drank even more. He took drugs, cocaine, and he basically hit the lowest point in his life. He ended up basically homeless in Central Park, New York. And Bobby Orr, who was his best friend, he was really concerned, and he went out of his way to try to find where Sanderson was. And eventually he found out about his dilemma and intervened and saved his life. And Sanderson was able to rebuild his life, get it back together, and became a financial advisor and planner and had a very successful career. So he's like one of the best stories coming out of it, but my God, he went for some serious travails in his life. And I think right now they just shot a movie on his life story, and I think God knows, given the pandemic, I think it's supposed to be scheduled for release sometime next year, but we'll see.
Okay. So we have a question typed in from, it says, is it true that Old Boston Garden was small and favored the defense?
It was definitely small. That's why the Bruins, when they would go up to Montreal had a much larger skating arena. Montreal had great skaters. The Bruins were usually at a disadvantage because they kind of play. It was almost like in basketball, they played more of a half-court game than a full-court game. But when you have a team with a skater like Bobby Orr on it, you know, wherever you played, it didn't matter that much.
Okay, so we have a question, or Laura has raised her hand, so we're going to allow Laura to talk. So Laura, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, so this is Joe. My screen didn't work, so I'm using Laura's.
Okay.
But in any case, I was a freshman in high school at that time, and I very well remember the parade. We skipped school in the afternoon, went into City Hall. It justified that ugly building because it was meant for civic celebrations like this, which were few and far between. And I got to tell you, just before that season, a year or two and after, Bobby had two columns in the Sunday Herald. One was like an Ask Beth advice to kids.
That's right.
And that was hockey tips. And I would open that religiously every week. And then just as a coder, I want to say that I was in an adult league, professional league, 13 years later, and we had snuck in a college player one week, and the other team retaliated and dropped the atom bomb and put Bobby Orr in the game against us. So it'd be like an altar boy serving the 7 o'clock mass and you find out the Pope sang it. So I got on my first shift. He's on defense. I scored.
Amazing.
And then he played for us half the game. Great guy, stayed for an hour, signed everybody's whatnot. And I have a picture in my office of the two of us going at it.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of stories like that. Bobby Orr was, you know, he was the real deal. You know, we've had a lot of superstar athletes, you know, like Larry Bird, the recently departed Tom Brady. But let's just say they were not copacetic with the general public. They were kind of hands off, arms off. Bobby Orr and that entire Bruins team, they embraced the public. And you have to remember, due to the low salaries in the NHL at the time, you know, they lived in like middle class at A and P, right? I mean, they were regular kind of, you know, distance that modern athletes have. And I remember I was around 5 years old. I remember going to meet Bobby Orr at the old Lechmere in Danvers, Massachusetts, shaking his hand. I remember being so nervous. I mean, he was so.
Well, I think we may have lost the connection with Tom Whalen, or at least meaningfully lost the connection. So it's also about 3 o'clock, so we've gone the full hour. So I would like to thank everyone. During these unusual times, the Massachusetts Historical Society is collecting stories of COVID-19 experiences. So if you have time, you're welcome to join us and share your experiences of COVID-19. And then finally, while we are aware that the economic shutdown has caused many people financial hardship, we're happy to offer our programs for free during this period. But again, the Mass Historical Society is an independent nonprofit organization, and we are supported through the donations of members, fellows, and friends. So if you enjoy our programming, we hope that you'll consider making a contribution to support our work. So I see that Tom has actually rejoined us, so I would like to thank him for his presentation. It was a great talk. We had a little bit of a technical glitch at the end, but it's been a wonderful program. And so I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the afternoon and enjoys their weekend. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone.